Webinar here today. We will give it just a minute or two here for everyone to filter in, watching the attendee list grow here. As we do so, as you're joining the chat here, joining the webinar here today, if you see the chat panel there, please do drop in there where you're calling from. It's always fun to see where around the globe we have attendees calling in from. So I'll go ahead and start it off here. Denmark, New Hampshire, Canada, Germany. We're already all around the globe here. Well, welcome all. We'll give this another 30 seconds or so. For those just jumping in, please do drop in the chat where you're calling in from. And welcome to all of those calling from all around the world. We're seeing lots and lots of continents, countries represented here. So welcome all. We'll jump in here momentarily. And Basil, I know you're at a hotel, but are you in Germany today or are you elsewhere today?
No, I'm not in Germany. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I am today in Sweden, so still in Europe, but in Sweden today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're at the 1 minute mark. Let's go ahead and get started. Firstly, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how much clinical data do you actually need? Have we overestimated the EU requirements? My name is Chris Rush. I'm a solutions engineer here at Greenlight, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's session is going to run for about 60 minutes in total, including roughly 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Dr. Basil Akra will take us through today's topic with insights on EU MDR 2017-745, as well as clinical data requirements versus nice to haves, how to avoid unnecessary PMCF, and how to right size your clinical strategy. For those who are new to these webinars here, let me quickly walk through the interface that we're looking at here on our screens. On the right side of your screen here, you'll see a few tabs. There is a chat tab. You'll want to use this chat tab. This is where everyone has dropped in, where they're calling from, for engaging with other attendees and posting general comments. There is a separate Q&A tab, and this is where you should submit any questions you would like Dr. Akra to address during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. So just want to reiterate that a lot of times people will drop things in the chat. Sometimes they get lost. I try and catch them if they're dropped in the chat. Please drop your questions in that Q&A tab. I won't be monitoring the chat tab quite as closely as that Q&A, so please use that Q&A tab for the questions. After the webinar here today, we'll send a follow-up email to all the registrants with the full recording and the slides, so you can revisit today's discussion at your convenience. So let me start sharing some pages here. So just a little bit about Greenlight Guru. I want to share a few words about Greenlight and why we put on these free sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and your patients is our mission here at Greenlight, probably a very similar mission as many of you joining us today. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving MedTech forward, and that means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in this heavily regulated industry, and our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed ultimately in the market. Greenlight Guru provides medical device companies with industry-leading quality management software and electronic data capture software to scale faster, become more efficient, and reduce risk throughout the product lifecycle. Today's webinar will focus on giving you expert insights from Basil into EU regulations to clarify when clinical data is truly necessary and when it may not be required at all. At Greenlight Guru, we built the leading toolbox for pre-market clinical data collection and management. Specifically designed for MedTech operations, Greenlight Guru Clinical is a single compliant platform for collecting and managing all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. If you're interested in learning more about our system and how it can help you streamline your clinical data for clinical investigations, you can schedule a demo with us simply by writing demo in the chat. We will receive that message. So go ahead and write demo in the chat if you'd like to do so, and we'll follow up with you directly. Now, I want to turn my attention to today's special guest, Dr. Basil Akra. Dr. Akra is the CEO and president of Akra Team in Germany and the USA. It's a global consultancy company. Dr. Akra has vast experience in leadership, business management, research and development, quality management, and regulatory approval of medical devices. Dr. Akra played an essential role during the implementation of the medical device regulation in Europe. He was also involved in the drafting of several European guidance documents, for example, the MedDev, MDCG, etc., as well as international standards. He spent the last years of his career at TÜV Süd, training and educating various stakeholders on EU legislation. Dr. Akra is also a member of the board of the EU Association Team PRRC. And lastly, he is also a member of the MDR EY Survey Advisory Group. We are thrilled to have him with us today. His insider perspective is invaluable, and we know you'll gain a lot from the insights that he is about to share. So let's go ahead and dive in. Dr. Akra, the floor is yours. Let's get started with your presentation, and welcome.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, I am so happy to see the global attendees today with us from the various countries listening to a topic which is actually key for all of us. And it should be boring already today after 7 years to still talk about the medical device regulations since its publication, but we still talk about it because it's challenging. And as Chris was mentioning, it is a topic which is keeping us awake at night, and we need to make sure that we understand how much is enough. What do we need to do? Are we overdoing, or can we actually work on a leaner process for the future? So I prepared for you a presentation where I'm going to give you some insights, starting by the state of play. Where are we today? The MDR, even after 7 years, is changing regularly, and I would like to tell you a bit more about what is happening, then telling you more about the requirement itself and what is nice to have. Then we're going to talk about post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up requirement, give you some recommendation on how to define whether the strategies that you are following and the plan that you have is necessary or you are overdoing, just to make sure that you just collect data whenever is needed. And then finally talking about if you need to collect data, what is actually the best approach to collect the data, because what you would need for a scalpel, or what you need for a sterile wrap, or what you need for a pacemaker or a hip implant, they might differ, and the strategy will have different actually expectation, different design expectation of the way that you're going to be collecting data, and therefore you need to think through it before you introduce your strategy and make sure that you are not doing something which will not be beneficial at the end. Starting with the MDR. Today, after 7 years of publication of that legislation, and by the way, the legislation MDR is under preparation since 2008, just to remember everyone. So if you bought a car in 2008, today you will look to it because it's rusty. You will not talk about it anymore. You're going to hide it from your neighbors because you don't want to show it to them anymore. MDR, everyone who talks about MDR still talk about it as it is new. It's a legislation which is under preparation since 2008, 2012, it became prominent, 2017 published. At the beginning, everyone was complaining about the number of notified bodies available to deliver MDR certification because the MDD available notified bodies were above 80 notified body at that time. And when the MDR got published in 2017, everyone was complaining because there was no notified body for the MDR, and the designation process of notified bodies started very slow at the beginning. So after 2 years, we just got like less than 5 notified bodies after publication of the regulation. And today, after 7 years of publication, we have 50 notified bodies already available and are able to offer services for the various medical devices on the market. Now, we need to keep in mind that not all of these notified bodies are allowed to do everything. Some of them have limited scope, some others have wider scope. But what is very interesting is to see the recent numbers, which came recently from the European Commission, which gave us an update on how many notified bodies to still expect in the medical device sector. So we see already, in 2017, when the MDR got published and started to be much more clear for everyone. At that time, we had 56 notified bodies for the directive, because the number in 2012 got down after the joint assessment measure related to the scandal and all the issues that happened in European Union. So at the time of publication of the regulation, we had 56 notified body for the directive. Today, we are targeting with the MDR designation that we will move towards the same number in the upcoming years. So what I showed you before with the 50 notified bodies available today will not remain the same. It will be even increasing in the upcoming months. So we still expect 12 additional notified bodies to come. They are still in the progress of being designated, which is important and key to know for you as a reminder. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time telling you and complaining about the MDR. I just want to remember all of us that the time is ticking and not everyone is ready on time. And I will explain to you why a lot of manufacturers are still struggling to move from MDD to MDR or IMDD to MDR. But what is actually shocking for everyone is, today we have additional time to place devices on the market till 2027, 2028, depending on the risk class of the device, which was provided by the European legislator as a measure after doing the detailed survey in 2022, where they recognized that we are heading toward the deadline of May 2024, and all what we have already in 2022, 10% of the MDD certificates issued under the MDR now. Now, if you look to the recent numbers, it's not actually more promising, because if you look to it, you see from a survey that was conducted by the industry that 57% of the manufacturer just have 10% of their product portfolio already MDR certified, which is a shocking number to look to it now today in 2024 to see that we are still actually moving like a snail toward the MDR. So just a few number of manufacturers feels that they are more than last ready. But you see actually from the numbers in front of us, a majority of industry is still in the progress of moving from the directive to the regulation. And this is connected to multiple factors. And the factors which are related to that are actually especially the clinical evidence level, clinical data, which are available for devices. A lot of manufacturers are still struggling being able to show their notified bodies at the time of certification sufficient amount and quality of data to be able to move their devices from a directive to the regulation. And some of them are still in the progress of doing post-market clinical follow-up under the directive to collect some data to enable them to actually get a submission with full evidence, enabling them to re-establish compliance and show them that they are actually in compliance with the new legislation. And this is costing a lot of time, and not just the clinical data. There are other aspects which are influencing design as well, manufacturing of manufacturer, that is leading to delays. But you see also that it is critical. And on top of that, we should not forget that the number of notified bodies that I showed you before just became actually to that level available in the past 2 years. Before that, we were actually struggling to have available notified bodies. Now notified bodies started to have more capacity because of the delay of timeline as well, because of the designation that happened in the past months, which allowed actually the system to be in a better space. Nevertheless, it's still scary to see actually those numbers, to see that we are still moving very slow, and we still have a lot of manufacturers who are not MDR certified yet, which means that the upcoming 2 to 3 years will be still challenging for all of us. And as Chris mentioned, we will be running in this dark space where we are trying to navigate and try to make sure that we are meeting the requirement. And I will try to contribute today with Greenlight Guru today to help you actually educate you on how you can address the requirement and what you need to consider to prepare yourself and make sure that your MDR certification, especially with regard to the clinical topic, is moving in the right direction. So let me focus on the clinical requirements. The most important aspect that I was stating to everyone since actually the initial drafts of the MDR in 2012, when we had the initial draft in place and people started to discuss the MDR. At that time, I said to everyone and still say to everyone today, please read it. If you don't read the legislation and you just visit a webinar for 1 hour or 2 hours, you will not become an expert, because a webinar will give you just an interesting insight about what is written in that legislation, will help you understand the connection between the dots, but you need to do your job as well. You need to read it by yourself and evaluate it by comparing the requirement to your available evidence and checking what are the gaps that you need to address, and prepare your documentation as well, your quality management system in compliance with the legislation. The MDR itself has a specific article and annexes, which are different to the directive, which are much more descriptive, and they include a lot of details about the clinical evaluation process, as well as the clinical investigation and post-market clinical follow-up. So I listed here on the slide a lot of articles which are relevant when we talk about clinical data, post-market data, and how you should be considering that in your documentation and in your process as a medical device manufacturer. Also, since now the publication of the regulation, we keep getting guidance documents. So those guidance documents give us a lot of clarification on what is needed for which type of device, and they have some connection to each other, because when we talk about the clinical evaluation process, clinical investigation process is connected to multiple other processes within the organization. So it's not a silo process. And when you look to the legislation, you need to look to the guidance document as well. Even if the guidance is written on the first page, they are legally not legal document, and you are not actually required to follow them by law. But if you look to actually why they were written, and you look to the MDR referred to MDCG guidance document to be the current interpretation, and the notified bodies are required to use those guidance documents. So based on that, they're going to expect you to show them that you are meeting the current state-of-the-art interpretation and expectation. So even if those are guidance documents, don't disregard them. They are relevant and important for you. And if you don't use them, the notified body will audit you according to those guidance. And some of these guidance include a lot of details which are helpful. Some others are actually very descriptive and include a lot of details which might be misleading you. So you need to check that. Important is that guidance will never overrule a regulation. So if you see something which is inconsistent with the regulation will be the applicable requirement that you need to follow. This is just an overview about guidances which are relevant. Please check them and see what is relevant for you, and make sure that you read them as well when you read the clinical evaluation requirement. Now, let me focus on the clinical evaluation itself, on the process. And I'm going to remember all of us about one important article in the MDR, which is Article 61.1, which is stating that it is the responsibility of the manufacturer, so you, as a subject matter expert, as a manufacturer, you need to specify and justify how much evidence is necessary for your type of device. Now, what you need to consider when doing that, you need to actually consider the intended purpose. You need to consider the current state of the art for that kind of device that you are actually trying to evaluate. And you need to understand and consider what is your marketing department planning to claim. All of these factors will play an important role on your decision-making, which is important at the initial step in the planning phase, because this will influence how much data you will justify to be at the end sufficient. Because you need to specify it first, like putting any protocol in place. And that specification will allow you to build a storyline, allowing a notified body or a competent authority to look through your documentation and to say, yes, I buy it, or no, I don't because of this. So you need to tell them the story, how you want to conclude. And this is important for every manufacturer, regardless of a classification of a device. Now, when the MDCG tried to help a manufacturer, and I was contributing to that guidance document preparation when I was representing notified bodies at the European level, at that time, we tried to actually help manufacturers by giving them guidance on the various kind of devices that might be today under the directive and would need to move to the regulation, or might be defined in the regulation as well-established technologies and need to move to the regulation. And that guidance document, MDCG 2020-6, introduces a lot of important principles which are forgotten by a lot of manufacturers, because a lot of people didn't read that guidance in details. Important principle which is included there is actually the principle of direct or indirect clinical data, which is very relevant for devices which are supportive devices. So if you have a guide wire for a stent, then you don't have just one approach to collect your evidence. You might rely on indirect clinical data to support your guide wire by looking to the stent procedure, to the stent implantation, and use the guide wire indirect data to justify safety and performance. And this principle is forgotten by a lot of manufacturers. So you need to understand, first of all, do I have a device which is itself providing the direct clinical benefit, or is it a device which is supporting a holistic procedure on itself, is not actually the main device, but it's a supportive device? The other principle which is included in this guidance document, which is also overseen by a lot of organizations, is the principle of having a device with an intended purpose, but without an indication. So, for example, a sterilization solution which is used during clinical procedure, which is cleaning a surface area of a medical device, that sterilization solution doesn't have an indication, because an indication is the clinical condition to be treated, diagnosed, and so on. That device doesn't have a clinical indication, but has an intended purpose. What does this imply on you? If you have such a device which has just an intended purpose without a clinical indication, then you might say, okay, perhaps for such a device, for example, if I have a sterile wrap or I have actually a cleaning solution, I might not need clinical data at all, and I might be able to follow 6110 and can actually proceed with a clinical evaluation report by relying on non-clinical data instead of having clinical data for my device. And those principles are, like I said, people do not see them. Now, also the well-established technology. Now, some notified bodies don't like that wording because they were punished by their authority to use that wording in the MDCG because it's inconsistent with the wording in the MDR. The MDR has specific devices listed as wet, whereas the MDCG says wet is wider than that list. Whereas if you look to the MDR again back, you will see that the MDR state just those devices listed there are deemed wet. And in addition to that list, should be provided by the European Commission by having additional amendment to the legislation. But this is not provided so far. Therefore, some authorities are challenging notified bodies if they widen that list. Therefore, some notified bodies might ask you not to use the wording well established, but talking about actually devices which are presenting the current clinical practice, and use those criteria to say this is actually the acceptable clinical practice procedure, methodology, or device. And therefore, if I evaluate my device by looking to its simplicity, to look to its well-known safety and performance profile, and to the long history on the market, I might be able to say that kind of device doesn't require the same level of evidence like a completely new device. And here I take, like, for example, as an example for this, an orthopedic plate, which is a standard plate which has been on the market since 50 years, or a guide wire. You can put such a device under this kind of category, and this categorization will help you later on having different level of evidence to support your device approval, which is different to devices like a pacemaker or a heart valve, where you would need higher ranking clinical data to get market access from directive to the regulation again. And I think what I'm trying to tell you here is actually we need to use our current knowledge and we need to use the current available guidance document to build our storyline. So when referring to the guide wire or referring to a plate, I was stating that actually if you are evaluating your clinical data at this moment and you recognize I don't have high quality studies, I don't have for such a device registry, but I have a combination of state-of-the-art data from similar devices, I have data from the procedure, I have data from equivalent devices, I have complaints data, some simulation data. Those holistic data which are clinically relevant can be used in a combination to justify for a device which is well-established technology, which is actually not a class 3 device, but perhaps a class 2B device, which is deemed to be also well established, or it is a class 3 device, but it is also well established, then you can use that combination of data to get that device on the market. Now, if you have a class 3 implantable device like a heart valve, which is not meeting the definition of a well-established technology, because a heart valve will be hardly able to fulfill those requirements, which I showed you before, then you would need rank 1 to rank 4 data. But if you have a guide wire or you have a plate, you will be deemed as well-established or current clinical practice device, then you will be actually able to justify lower rank clinical evidence to get to the market from MDD to MDR. So you need to consider all of these approaches when you are looking to your data. You need to remember the principle of intended purpose without an indication, the principle of direct, indirect clinical data, plus also the qualification of your product to be either well established or not, because those will have an influence on how much data you would need to get to the market. So the clinical evaluation process has actually is a process which starts with a protocol, with a plan at the very early stage, where you need to understand, what do I want to achieve? And to be able to define how much data would be sufficient at the end, you need to understand your device. You need to understand your intended purpose, your indication, your claims. And at the end, you will be actually questioned whether your data are sufficient based on the evidence that you can provide. And when you do that, you need to consider, am I addressing all my claims? Am I addressing all the indication that I'm listing? I'm addressing all the patients groups that I'm trying to cover. Do I have actually addressed my performance and safety criteria that I have established from state of the art? Those questions need to be at the end clarified and answered. And if you have a gap, some of the gaps might be addressed via an additional post-market clinical follow-up activity. Some of the gap need to be addressed before getting to the market. And I'll give you an example later on when we talk about post-market clinical follow-up, what can be pushed to post-market clinical follow-up and what cannot be pushed to there because of the necessity of showing compliance before you enter the market. Now, very important and very key, in case you evaluate your claims or your indication or your patient population and you recognize you have a gap, ask yourself, why do I have a gap? Look to the usage of the device, look to the sales number of the device. Try to understand, is this indication important for the healthcare system? Do I have really a patient for that kind of device? Why I'm telling you that? Because a lot of manufacturer comes to me as like, I want to keep my indication or I want to keep my patient population. And when I ask them why, majority cannot answer that because they didn't do a thorough evaluation of the market and try to understand, is it actually necessary? And a lot of justification comes from the fact it has been actually always like this and other competition had it like that, so we want to have the same kind of claims. So the claim should be connected with a clinical reason, and you might have patient population which has actually limited ability to get a device, and they might be actually treated 1 or 2 times per year. No one will be asking you for such a patient population to have clinical data before you get to the market. You can justify why those patients will not be studied, but will be covered perhaps by your post-market activities, and you're going to collect data. But if you have a patient population which is getting 1 million devices per year, you cannot say, I don't have an ability to collect data. But then you need to understand the principle of collecting data, understand what kind of data would be enabling me to move from MDD to MDR by remembering what I told you about supportive devices and devices providing their safety and performance by direct clinical data, where you can study them directly by themselves. So the principle of sufficiency is actually can be considered from 2 factors, and it's not so different to what we have been doing actually under the directive. It's just a bit more descriptive now today with the MDR, giving you a lot of explanation to help manufacturers. But you need to look to, do I have sufficient amount of data and sufficient quality? What does it mean in lay language? So if you say, I can do this, then you have to deliver evidence that you can do it. And that evidence should not be just one case showing that it can be done, but it should be actually scientifically solid to say, I did a study or I did a pre-market or a preclinical or a bench evaluation, and that claim that I'm putting in front of us is a claim which is supported by technical, biological, or clinical data, because not every claim requires clinical data. Some claims might be addressed by technical data, by other kind of indirect data, and some claims must be clarified by clinical evidence. And you need to look to what are we referring to and what would be necessary to be able to meet the requirement and show compliance. Now, very key and very critical for a lot of manufacturers, like I said multiple times today, not every device is required to have clinical data, because clinical data is a data that is collected on 1 or more human subject via a study that you are doing on that patient. And this could be actually published data, could be a study that you have done by yourself, could be a registry. But there are some devices that do not require clinical data. Like I mentioned, a syringe as well without a needle is a syringe. What kind of clinical data you're going to need to collect? But you need to be careful because your marketing claims can trigger clinical data requirements. So you need to understand your device, describe that device, its functionality, its characteristic, its performance criteria, and then define what would be necessary to show that that device is performing as intended, is safe, and has the relevant clinical benefit which is required by state of the art to be delivered with such a device. And then based on that, you're going to define what would be my clinical strategy. And the regulation gives you an opportunity to have devices approved based on no clinical data. You still have to write a clinical evaluation, but that clinical evaluation doesn't require inclusion of clinical data in it. Important is that pathway 6110 is not like a waiver for manufacturer who doesn't have clinical data by definition. So if you have a heart valve, which was under the directive on the market, and now you recognize for the MDR, my data are not sufficient, you cannot say, yes, I use 6110 and move to the market. This will not be accepted because it's not actually a clear card giving you an opportunity to avoid clinical data. It's just when the device is allowed to have non-clinical data pathway, it has to be justified, and that justification needs to come from your risk management, your claims, and based on that, you need to build your conclusion on why your strategy is acceptable. Don't forget, like I said multiple times, what is your marketing saying? Make sure that the marketing claims are actually considered from the beginning, from the planning phase, to ensure that in case you want to have a device which is following 6110, then you need to avoid any claim which can trigger actually additional clinical data collection requirement. But if your device characteristics show you that it can be moved without clinical data, and you can support it by risk-based justification and evidence that that device doesn't require clinical data, and your claim doesn't have any additional burden on you, then you will be able to succeed. Please be careful with marketing because a lot of situation goes in the wrong direction because of marketing claims which they are forgotten, put on the website or in promotional material, which will be then subject to an assessment, and then you will be again moving to ground zero where you need to start again to discuss your strategy and prove that your evidence are sufficient to meet the requirement. Software are different. Software are also medical devices, and software manufacturers have also additional approaches that they need to consider. A lot of software manufacturers rely sometimes on old methodologies that they were doing by comparing apples with oranges and try to get their software to the market. There is a specific guidance which is giving manufacturer clarity on how a medical device software can be evaluated with regard to its clinical requirement and how a software can conclude as well it's safe and performing as intended. And when we talk about the software, it's all about accuracy and reliability of that software to deliver actually the characteristic which is defined to be related to it. And typically a software is based on a valid clinical association. So you need to understand what is actually why I'm doing this software. What is this software doing? And there is a lot of different software. So we should not mix up software which are integrated in a device. Those software will be actually covered by the holistic device clinical evaluation. When we talk about the software, which is, for example, an app, and that app is, for example, looking into predicting pregnancy or looking into your cardiac behavior, those software will have different kind of data for evaluation, and you need to understand, first of all, what is the current state of the art, the same principle. Is this something which I'm building based on known, or is it something which I'm building based on big data? And then you need to understand what is the software doing. Is it delivering a diagnosis? Is delivering a recommendation, or is delivering a treatment, and or is it monitoring a patient? All of these criteria will define the key safety and performance criteria for you and for your software, which allow you to decide in the same principle like any clinical evaluation. You need to plan, define how much data would be sufficient. You're going to be looking into the technical performance data. You're going to be looking into the valid clinical association, which is much more the state of the art. And then you're going to be defining, do I need to do a clinical data collection via clinical performance study to get data? And then you're going to appraise the data, analyze the data, and come to the conclusion again, similarly to any medical device. So you see a software has similar principle, but different wording that you need to consider to ensure that you are compliant. Now, moving forward, even if I got a device on the market, there is that obligation for post-market. And that obligation is not just because someone want to tease us. It is necessary because not every device achieves its performance within minutes or seconds. A lot of devices are actually devices which stay on the market in the patient for longer term, or might have an implication on the patient, on the healthcare system on a longer term. So even if you use a catheter, which is just for 30 minutes in the patient, that 30 minutes might give you actually the direct effect of the catheter. You can find the performance, but if you want to look to safety of that catheter, you might need to monitor it longer term because you might create damages to the patient, which you cannot see immediately. Therefore, you need to confirm that it was safe on a longer term. And the PMCF is a small piece of the post-market surveillance, but it's not actually like just focusing on high-level information. It's specific to clinical information. And not every device would be required to do a post-market clinical follow-up study or a post-market clinical follow-up registry. Some devices might be able to rely on general methodologies which are defined in the legislation to be possible. This is why the legislator said to us, we need to have a post-market surveillance plan for every device. And within that post-market surveillance plan, we need to have a post-market clinical follow-up plan. And in that PMCF plan, there are methodologies which are deemed general and some methodologies which are deemed specific. The specific ones are specifically there for devices which requires midterm and long-term data. For example, if you have a heart valve, you don't get that device on the market by having 10 years or 15 years clinical studies. You do that by getting 2 years, 3 years clinical data, and then you get to the market. But those patients will have that device for a longer term. Therefore, a post-market clinical follow-up is necessary. But then you need to define how long shall I follow the patient? And then you need to consider what are the standard telling me, what the state of the art telling me. So those specific PMCF doesn't need to run forever. They need to have a defined time, and that defined time comes from actually your expected lifetime for that device, which allow you to define how long shall I follow the patient to be able to confirm safety and performance, identify the unknown that I couldn't identify before, and so on. And it's not always required to have a study. You might have a registry, you might have prospective, retrospective data analysis. You might have a combination of multiple methods. And for some devices, you might justify, for that device design, I have enough data that I don't need to collect new data. And then you'd focus just on reviewing the literature till you do any significant change to the design or you get any signal from the market, then you reevaluate again, do I need a specific PMCF? And this is the principle where a lot of manufacturers forget to do, and also notified bodies sometimes are pushing manufacturing the wrong way. And like I said, the data is not always one single source that you need to run out and just look to studies or look to registries. There is a lot of data out there, and you need to select what would be the best suitable methodology for my device. And then you need to ask yourself, do I need this data, and for how long, and what kind of data do I need? And this is very key because not all data are important. So I saw a lot of manufacturers doing survey just to satisfy the request of a notified body. And some of these surveys were actually good. Some others were very bad because they were not just saying, do you like my packaging? Do you like the color of our labeling? This is not clinical data. This is not adding value. So if you do a survey, you need to do it in a way which is reasonable. And then you need to ask yourself why you are doing that. And you need to define what are the criteria that you're going to collect out of it and how you're going to use the data. So you should not just collect data. You need to define already in advance, if I'm collecting that data, it will contribute to this and that. And this, what we saw before on the slide before, should be connected to your methodology. So if you say, I'm doing a retrospective analysis, I'm doing that to identify and analyze emerging risk. Then I understand, okay, this methodology is for this purpose. If I'm doing a study, I'm doing this to confirm safety. I got you. So you need to define which method will be used for which requirement to make sure that it is clear for yourself, but also for the reader of your documentation. And like I said, the post-market clinical follow-up is actually a principle which has a relationship to your expected lifetime that you have defined for your device, and or the effect of your device on the body. So if you have an absorbable device which will be absorbed within 30 days, it doesn't mean that the lifetime is 30 days, because that absorbed material might remain in your body for at least 6 months or 1 year. So your safety measure will not be just after 30 days. But some devices which have an effect, for example, a scalpel or a device which is used immediately on the patient, you can show the performance immediately. And also the safety might not need more than 30 days follow-up, and then you have your data. And then you could justify, I don't need the post-market clinical follow-up specific one. I will keep monitoring the literature. I will keep getting customer feedback, but I don't need to do more. For a heart valve, it's a different story. For a pacemaker, it's a different story, because those devices remain in the body for 10, 15, 20 years. So your PMCF strategy might rely on registries, on studies, on prospective, retrospective data analysis. And this is important that you consider when you are preparing your strategy and defining the best approach. Now, as I mentioned, there are pathways where you can go through clinical data collection, some others which can be relying on equivalent devices, some devices which can justify they have sufficient evidence because they are well established, or they are actually devices which have sufficient data based on the MDCG 2020-6 criteria. Some devices, they don't need clinical data at all because from their characteristic, they don't require clinical data. But for some devices, you would need also clinical data. And I gave an example, like I have a pacemaker, I have a new hip prosthesis, or I have actually a plate which is with a specific clinical claim, then I would need to collect clinical data. And now, if we look to this, again, you need to define, if I want to collect data, I need to understand, first of all, what is the current state of the art for that indication which I'm trying to target. And for that indication, I need to identify what are the key safety and performance criteria, which would allow me to state at the end that my device is safe and performing as intended. And when I define that, I will need to define my strategy. And that strategy is established in the MDR, in the guidance, which is saying to us, manufacturer, please make sure that you collect your data in a systematic way. Make sure that you have devices that are planned with a clinical approach, that you know actually what are the safety criteria, the performance criteria that you need to collect, and build a study plan which is looking into not just immediately going with a short study, 30 days, 30 patients, and that's it. You need to consider, what am I looking for, and follow a strategy which allow you over a long term to collect the data in a way which is enabling you to justify by the end your conclusion that the device is safe and performing as intended. And just then you have a good strategy. And this is why they use the approach which was established in the pharmaceutical world for phase 1 to phase 4, and they build it in a clinical development plan and the clinical evaluation principle to make sure that manufacturers understand a clinical investigation is not just actually something to be done to collect data. It has to be done systematically in a way that if you collect data, that it is collected in a way to answer the questions which are open for a specific device. So collecting data just to make a notified body or an authority happy doesn't make sense. You should do it for yourself if you can justify based on your claim, risk management, and your current evaluation that there is a gap. During that clinical evaluation process, you need to define what kind of data will close the gap before you re-evaluate the data and build the conclusion that that device is safe and performing well. And the clinical evidence package is never the pre-market evidence. It's a combination of pre-market data and post-market data. And just that storyline would allow you to build the story to tell a notified body or an authority that your device has enough evidence to support safety, performance, and the clinical benefit claim that you have. So if we look to the clinical evaluation itself, it's a connection between clinical evaluation, clinical investigation. There is a lot of annexes and articles in the regulation which allow you to understand more about it. Very important as well is the ISO 14155, which gives you good principle on how and what kind of data planning would be considered to be good quality. And this kind of methodology would allow you to have higher level of success if you build your clinical strategy for European application. I shared a lot of details in a short presentation. I hope I could trigger a lot of discussion. I'm looking forward to hear your questions. And if we don't have enough time today to answer all your questions, you can follow up with us or write me on LinkedIn or get my contact details from Greenlight Guru to reach out and get your question answers. But now I will give it back to Chris, and looking forward to hear your burning questions to see what you are struggling with and how can I help you preparing a better strategy.
And we will start with the most burning questions. So thank you again for the presentation. Wonderful content. We're going to, again, for the entire team here that's attending, we will prioritize the questions that are most upvoted. So please do jump in there, keep on voting for those questions. We have one with, this is the clear runaway winner. So let's go ahead and share the question. It is a little bit lengthy. Dr. Akra, I'll let you read this yourself. Everyone can read this here. I won't make you read it out loud. And fire away when you're ready here.
Yeah, I see the question. So actually, as I mentioned before, a PMCF plan, in contradictory to the directive requirement, the PMCF plan is actually an obligation for all manufacturers due to one factor, the general PMCF, which is actually relying on a literature. Literature cannot be avoided. You need to search the literature. But you can avoid a study, PMCF study, in case you have sufficient data for your device. So I give you an example just to make it actually much more visual for you. If you have a device which has an expected lifetime of 5 years, and you look to the key safety and performance criteria, which are extracted from state-of-the-art, and you have 5 years clinical data addressing those key safety and performance criteria, there is no open question to do a specific PMCF, so you can rely solely on the general PMCF and you stop doing proactive specific PMCF. So if you look to the guidance, MDCG 2020-7, and you look to Annex 14 Part B, it differs between general and specific PMCF. So you can get rid of the specific PMCF just in case you have enough data to address the expected lifetime, but you are still required to do the general PMCF. And we saw that successfully with the various manufacturers achieving success and getting approval with that approach.
Thank you for that. Next question here is related to sample size. I'll go ahead and read this one here for everyone. Any advice on how to determine appropriate sample size for PMCF activities would be appreciated. Thank you, Victoria, for the question.
So this is a very good question. I mean, it's like not that easy to define a sample size, like telling you take 100, take 200. I can't answer it as such because it's always relying on what are the questions that we are trying to address in which period of time. So a sample size, my recommendation is always to consider your the patient population, the sales number that you have per year, the available market, and then you use actually your key safety and performance criteria that you are trying to address and involve a statistician to justify your sample size. There is no clear recommendation for every single device. So some devices might need 50 patients, some other devices might need 500, third device might need 2,000 patients. Depends on the questions that you're trying to answer and the methodologies that you are applying and the patient population that you are trying to address. There is a lot of factors out there which can influence it. So my recommendation always for sample size, just consider actually inclusion of a biostatistician who refers clearly to statistical method when looking to PMCF activity. Don't forget that the PMCF is deemed as a widespread usage and widespread actually data collection, which will happen not just on actually multiple users, but also on various patient population to ensure like widening the data and getting more evidence. Typically what you have done on a pre-market will be multiplied on a post-market. So it's never the same number, it's much more on a post-market because you are trying to address the unknowns and you cannot address it with the same number like a pre-market.
Richard's asking, if the necessary data is determined via justification based on intended use, claims, et cetera, what would an example of a nice to have be as opposed to a necessary requirement?
So a manufacturer who's defining, so I have a case where a manufacturer actually defined for his device pathway to say I don't need to follow clinical data approach. But then they say we do a survey to collect data on that device usage. Then the question is, why do you do that? Why you are going with a survey outside and you're asking the physician about the use of a device. So for example, if you have a steroid wrap and you say, actually, I could justify safety and performance with non-clinical data, and then you say, I'm going to be sending a questionnaire to the user to ask them about actually their satisfaction with my device. This is a customer feedback, is not actually necessary for PMCF activity. You are doing this because you feel it is necessary to hear the user, but it is much more nice to have than actually an obligation, because for that device, you could justify safety and performance by non-clinical data, and you don't need to collect additional survey data unless you need to use it for marketing purpose. Another example would be a manufacturer who decided to do a post-market clinical follow-up study with 2,000 patients and believe that this is necessary. But if you dig into the details, this was actually one of the resource said this would be a good number to attack our competition. So it's a nice to have, it's not a requirement. So the requirement never defined to you how many patients. They ask you to justify your patient. And if you overdo, no one will tell you actually you are overdoing. If you underdo, you're going to be challenged. But if you overdo, they will let you go, because they will say, okay, good for me, I don't care.
Great answer. The next question is from Yasmin. What's the difference between clinical evaluation plan and the clinical development plan? I know the CDP must be included in the CEP, but I'm not sure about what should be included in the CDP.
Yeah, so very good point. So the clinical evaluation plan is actually the holistic plan for your clinical evaluation, which means what is the intended use, what are the claims, what are my criteria to show safety and performance, which strategy I'm going to follow to do a clinical evaluation. Whereas the clinical development plan is focusing on the way how you're going to collect data. So those phases that I presented, phase 1 to phase 4, so to say, I'm going to do a first in human, and that first in human will have that actually synopsis. I'm going to do a pilot study, and this is how it should be designed. And the clinical, on a post-market, I'm going to do this kind of study and registry. The clinical development plan can be part of the clinical evaluation plan, but it can be also separated. You are not obliged to have two different documents. You can combine them. It depends on how much details you're going to include in the clinical development plan. So it might be for readability purpose that some manufacturer might separate them, but there is no obligation for that. And why they can be combined and why they are actually included together, because the clinical development plan, so your clinical data collection strategy, is contributing to your clinical evaluation plan. This is why by legislation they say the clinical evaluation plan include the clinical development plan.
Next question is from, I'm going to probably butcher the name, so I won't attempt it. Question is related to MDCG 2020-6. I need all clinical data for cumulative example. If I don't have an equivalent device, is it acceptable?
So if you have a well-established technology device, and which is a legacy device as well, and you want to make use of actually lower level of evidence than rank 1 to rank 4, you are not required to have for every ranking data. You are required to have actually the data which you have. And they say you don't rely just on one source, you should rely on a storyline. So it's a cumulative combination of the multiple data set. So if you don't have an equivalent device, you can still rely on similar devices, on state-of-the-art, on complaints data, post-market data, stimulation, bench, and so on to build your story. Important is that you have a story which make use of the available data sources, and you are not required to have from 1 to 12 or from 1 to 4 or from 5 to 12. You might have 1, 5, 6, 12, or you might have 5, 6, 8, 9, 12. As long as your story is clear and justifies safety and performance of a device, this is possible.
We are about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to keep on going here, Dr. Akra. Hey Bay is asking, can no EU clinical study be used to support a CE application? I believe I know the answer, but that's what you're here for, Dr. Akra. Go ahead.
So the European requirement doesn't have a specific obligation that the data need to be collected in the EU. Nevertheless, the European requirement says that the data need to be relevant for the European population. So if you are collecting data or using data from non-European countries, you need to justify the transferability of the data. You need to pay attention to the patient population. You need to pay attention to how the data were collected. So did it follow good ethical and clinical practice? Then you need to consider, is it collected under the same clinical condition which can be used in the EU, and so on. If you can justify the transferability of the data, you can use data from non-European countries. Now, there are some notified bodies in the EU which will set expectation either on a pre-market or a post-market to say, at least I need a percentage of the patient which are done in the EU, but this is not written in the legislation. So you need to actually justify the transferability of the data. And if you can do that, then you should be able to move forward and get your device approved based on non-European data. And we have hundreds of examples that succeeded as such.
Keith's asking, is there a guidance document for claims and intended purpose, or is this something that comes from clinical setting or from the manufacturer?
So the claims are typically actually the creation of your marketing teams. They like to have claims. Now the regulation states that you can claim anything that is supported by evidence. So there is a specific article on claim in the regulation which is talking about actually what the manufacturer can claim. And they say if your claim shall not be misleading or actually leading to off-label usage of the device. So you need to be careful in your claims. And claims is not just actually what you write, also the figure that you use. So if you have a device which is just intended for use on patient population, which is elderly patient population, and you put a picture on the marketing brochure of a baby, so you are doing an indirect claim, and this might be leading to misleading claim, which is incorrect. So you need to consider actually the legislation, which is talking about what is allowed to be claimed. You need to consider the MDCG guidance 2020-6 with regard to the definition of an intended purpose, as well as Blue Guide and the regulation, which includes a lot of helpful information. But there is no specific guidance which is focusing on this. And I do not recommend that you ask for more guidance, because more guidance means more to interpret and additional requirement to follow. And this drives everyone crazy nowadays. So let's focus on what is available. And I think if you look to what is available, it will be sufficient to build your conclusion.
Colin's asking if a change midway through PMCF activity is determined to be non-substantial, that change is non-substantial, is it necessary to restart PMCF activities for the product?
So if you say non-substantial is a wide claim as is, because non-substantial change depends what you are doing. So if you have a device which is on the market and you do a change which is deemed non-substantial, this means that you can implement it without actually involving the notified body in the approval process. This is why you qualify to be non-substantial. But at the end, you need to consider, if you are collecting post-market clinical follow-up data, that you collect that on that relevant device. Now, non-substantiality can build a justification to say, I will not repeat the activity. But if that non-substantial justification might have an impact on the long-term data, or the unknown data, you better actually consider this. But you don't need to repeat PMCF every time. PMCF might be repeated in case a change to the design will be introduced, or a change to the material will be introduced, or a change to the indication might be introduced, or to the intended patient population. So you need to check the impact of the change on the clinical benefit conclusion and potential midterm or long-term data. And then you need to decide, do I need to do a new PMCF, or is it actually sufficient what I have? And can I build the transferability of my data to the final device with those non-substantial change? Because a non-substantial change could be that you did the correction in the IFU, which was a typo. So you need to repeat the PMCF for a typo. And depends what is that change. But I think in general, no, you don't need to do that.
And we're getting close on time here. We are able to go a little bit over. Dr. Akra, if you're okay with going a few minutes over, is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, sure. We'll take one more question here and then we'll wrap. But you attendees might notice we haven't gotten to every question, so we appreciate all of the questions, and we'll share this with Dr. Akra as well, of course. Final question here, and we've gotten some pointed questions. This one's a little bit more broad, open-ended question. Any advice on PMCF in the context of software as a medical device?
Yeah, so software as a medical device, I mean, software is not software. So you have a lot of software. Some software might have actually by themselves an ability to collect data, which are actually because they collect their own data. So they have a registry integrated in them. So for those devices, you should be building a system in place to enable you to use those data and ensure that you can use them also for your PMCF perspective. But let's say if you have a device which is, for example, monitoring the heart or health specific parameter of a patient. So you need to actually confirm that this is doing the right job. So you might decide to do a registry to collect data, or you might decide to have a PMCF survey to collect the data. I think software are too wide from their actually different functionality and availability on the market. And some software might rely on their own data setting because they do actually their data collection by themselves. Some other software might require PMCF survey, and some of them will need a specific registry or a study to be able to meet the requirement. As we know, most of the software are in 2A to class 3, so they are lower class to high class devices. For those leading into class 3 classification, they might need even studies. For those that are in 2A or 2B, you might be able to have different kind of data to justify them. And some of them might rely solely on general PMCF because their effect is not long-term. It's not like an implantable device, but it's always dependent on the intended purpose of the device, on the expected lifetime of that device, which will allow us to define what would be the best PMCF strategy. And the most important critical piece related to software is the change that happened with the software, which might trigger actually various activities post-market. And therefore, what makes sense for a software is always a registry which is collecting the various variance data instead of having studies every time.
Wonderful. Well, we really appreciate your time for the presentation as well as for the Q&A, Dr. Akra. And I know today you're in Sweden. If anyone recognizes that hotel, you know where you might be able to find him today. But if you want to find Dr. Akra through LinkedIn, of course, he is has a huge following on LinkedIn. Anywhere else you want to share or reiterate just in terms of how people might find you, Dr. Akra, before I conclude?
No, I think you did it well, Chris. So I shouldn't be found in the hotel. I hope for positive reason to have a drink, not for something else. So no one should attack me in the hotel for saying something wrong. But if you have any question or you feel that there is a need for a clarification on one or other topic, you can drop me a link in message. You can find me there, or you can write me an email. And this is I'm going to put in the chat my email address. You can write me an email directly, and I'm happy to support you and wish you all the best with MDR and all other topics. And if there is anything else that you need, just let me know. And looking forward to the next event with Greenlight Guru. We try always to support educational session and happy to contribute to such events that Greenlight Guru is contributing towards educating the regulatory and quality professionals.
Absolutely. And I've seen you in person, seen you here on virtual webinars, always engaging presenter. So we appreciate your time and your valuable insights. As one final reminder, today's recording and presentation slides will be sent to you in the following days. We've gotten that question in the chat a couple times, so we will be sending that to you. Thank you all again for attending today's presentation, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time. Dr. Akra, you can click on leave stage. That'll take you backstage again, and we can just debrief real quick.